You're listening to Power Athlete Radio, a podcast dedicated to empowering your performance every damn day. Join former NFL pro and Power Athlete founder John Welborn as he dissects the greatest minds in strength, conditioning, and more. So whether your goal is to be the hammer, destroy mediocrity, or simply move the dirt, you've come to the right place. Now with the warm-up done, let the gains begin.
Over time, we realized that X factor is durability, right? But this model revolutionized it because it showed us that these static values do hold some weight. They just don't explain everything, right? Because we assume that these static values stay the same across performance. We assume that athlete is able to be at a VO2 max of 65 at any point during that race. We assume that their lactate threshold will always be at 85% during that race. We assume that the running economy will not change with fatigue. All of those assumptions, though, we know are wrong, but that model works on those assumptions. So it's not a question of will they decline, they will decline. So the question actually is how much do they decline and can we change that, right? So the gap between these predicted natural outcomes, that's durability, right? So how do we define durability? Well, again, from that Maunder paper, durability is the time of onset and the magnitude of deterioration in physiological characteristics over time during prolonged exercise, right? So it's two things. It's the time that it happens, and it's the magnitude, so how much degradation, right? So we can think about this. Maybe we've been on teams with folks. One guy maybe 10 minutes into the match, right? I'm talking like rugby. 10 minutes into the match, they just seem like they're moving a little bit slower, but they kind of maintain that for the remainder of the match. So maybe there's only like a 5% degradation. Maybe the other guy is good for the first 30 minutes, but then drops completely off, and there's a 30%, right? So it happens at different times and to different magnitudes, and so we need to keep both of those in mind when we define durability. And we also need to talk about what durability is not, and this is where a lot of you are wrong, but it's not your fault because it's easy to interchange some things, right? Durability is not mental toughness or grit or any other synonym for that, right? It is not fatigue resistance, and it is not interchangeable with resilience. Those are on the psychological side of things, right? They are valuable, but the uniqueness of durability is its measurable physiological outcomes, right? We can measure these, objectively measure these. All of these top three, they're pretty subjective measurements, right? As most psychological measurements are. Durability is an objective physiological measurement we can make. And because it's measurable, that also means it's pretty easily trainable, or at least simply. We can simply train it as well. And it always relates to a performance-related degradation. I'm sure we've all had teammates, or maybe we are that person ourselves, where they might be a great athlete, but they're just a basket case, right? So they lack that mental toughness, but it doesn't really affect their performance. They've learned how to cope with it, right? Durability will always have a negative effect on performance, right? It'll always be a degradation. So mental toughness matters, but durability is physiological and most importantly measurable. But again, just to reiterate how important mental toughness is, right? In 2024 Paris Olympics, there are a few durability contests, okay? The road cycling race, 273 kilometers, right? Takes about 6 hours. The two marathons, men and women, both of them took more than 2 hours, right? So it's inherent that they're mentally tough, okay? Right now, all of us aren't mentally tough to go 5 minutes without looking at our phone, right? And these guys are cranking for 6 hours, sole focus, right? Just hammering away for 6 hours. So the mental toughness, the psychological side is kind of baked into a lot of these athletes. Tyson kind of talked about that before. Go on a 10-mile run, find yourself 5 miles out. Doesn't matter how much you hate it, you got to run 5 miles back, right? So this endurance training builds that mental toughness. But over 6 hours, I mean, think about it. You're cranking away on the bike for 6 hours. Durability is going to play a huge role there because you know you will degrade, right? You know your physical performance will degrade. So these endurance contests, in my view, they're just durability contests, right? All of these individuals have fresh state physiological variables that are the same, okay? But that only gets them to the starting line. It's the durability that's going to get them on the podium, okay?
We interrupt this episode with a shameless self-promotion. Let me introduce you to our Holistic Athlete Movement Readiness Program, also known as Hammer. Created after working extensively with Naval Special Warfare, the U.S. Army, Marines, and first responders. Hammer is battle-tested training sharpened at the highest level, delivering when it counts. If you're a warfighter, door kicker, or first responder, head to powerathletehq.com/hammer and claim your 7-day free trial today. Now back to the show.
So how do we measure it? Well, we'll talk a little bit about lab measurements. Cardiac drift is probably the easiest one to measure. So what cardiac drift is, there is a linear relationship between heart rate and power output, right? You can think about that as pace. You can think about it as wattage on the bike. As that increases, there's a linear increase in heart rate as well, to a point, until it starts getting longer, prolonged exercise. So this figure we're looking at over here on your left, this vertical dashed line is the marker at 10 kilometers. The data included in here is like 86,000 marathon runners, okay? And they're all measuring heart rates. They set this point at 10 kilometers because you can see to the left of that, it's a pretty linear increase in heart rate. That's what we're seeing here with the data. Pretty linear increase with heart rate. But after that 10 kilometers, we start to see three pretty well-defined types of athletes. We have people who have low cardiac drift, moderate cardiac drift, or a high degree of cardiac drift, meaning there's what we call decoupling. So now, like with these high cardiac drift athletes, their heart rate is increasing beyond what their workload should elicit, right? So their heart rate is beating faster for the intensity that they're at. So typically we say there's about a 5% drift that we can assume, but looking at this data, that's just an assumption of averages. If you get stuck with some high cardiac drift athletes, you might see their heart rate increase, magnitude of 0.3, so 30% higher than what we would expect it to be. So when we think about heart rate zones, this is kind of one of the issues with it, right? Depending on how long the exercise is, those heart rate zones can be null, okay? Now, what I like about this, for you all, this is the most accessible way. Throw a heart rate monitor on, measure the change, right? So you all can do this. We'll talk about later in the talk what I call some Monday morning strategies that you all can take back right away. But for this, the important thing to think about with most athletes, 5% is the assumption, but you need to establish those individual baselines to really understand your athlete when you measure them. The next way to measure it is power degradation. So what we're seeing here on the left, maybe we'll bring back some PTSD. This is some data from 3-minute all-out tests, okay? 3-minute all-out tests we probably vividly remember. Obviously, I don't, Dave, right? Because I've never done one, right? No. Yeah, okay. So this 3-minute all-out test, it's tough to see, but this solid line is just a 3-minute all-out test. And that establishes what we're looking at is their power profile. So on the y-axis, we have power output. 3-minute all-out test, for those of you who weren't here last year or have blocked it out of your memory, it is a true all-out test. 3, 2, 1, go. Right away, you're hammering as hard as you can, and you're pushing as hard as you can for the whole 3 minutes. So we see this big peak in power, but then we just start to degrade, right? And you guys probably remember this last minute just being the absolute worst minute of your life, right? Now, you thought I was a little brutal putting through one 3-minute all-out test. In this study, what they did was a 3-minute all-out test as baseline, but then a 3-minute all-out test with 40, 80, and 120 minutes of exercise prior to that. Right? And it was at a moderate intensity. So they're cranking away for 2 hours prior to doing then a 3-minute all-out test. And they look to see what kind of degradation in power output. And so that's what we're seeing over here on the right. Now it looks like there's not much difference. So no significant difference between these first three. So the baseline, 40 and 80 minute extra exercise. With 120 minutes, they did see a change. But for those of you not familiar with statistics or understanding how it works, these are what we call error bars, meaning the individual data was spread by about that much. So on average, the groups didn't show any difference, but on the individual level, there are some individuals who lost a third of their power after some of these exercise conditions. And so also I want to go back to the mental toughness. Let's think about, like those of you who rolled last night at the gym, right? How hot was it? It was hot, right? How many times did we say on the kick around with Alpha to pull down? These athletes feel that, and they say, no, I'm going to push myself until my body shuts down, right? So back to that mental toughness. It's baked in on this, but that's not durability, right? So the circulation crisis is that your body is always going to choose to cool it off. And ultimately, if that goes uncontrolled, It's going to shut the body down. Now, the next crisis is the fuel crisis, and ideally for these moderately high to high intensity exercise bouts, our body's burning glycogen. You can think about that like premium gasoline. We have a good amount of glycogen stored in our muscles. We have a little bit of glycogen stored in our livers, but once it goes, if we're not refueling, if we're not replenishing that glycogen as we're burning it, it's going to go, right? It's a finite store. So what happens is we blow through the muscle, we blow through the liver glycogen, and our body has to go to fat oxidation, right? Because it doesn't have that glycogen that it wants to use. And so you can think about that's like switching from premium to diesel, right? Diesel's great fuel, but for those of us who've had diesel vehicles, what do we got to do? Well, first we got to let the blow plugs warm up, right? We can't just turn it over right away. So diesel burns a little dirtier. It's still a good fuel, but it just takes a little longer, right? Same thing with fat oxidation. Fat oxidation actually returns way more ATP, way more energy than glycogen, but it just takes a little bit longer. And when we're in events that are dictated by time, we don't want to take any longer than we have to. So it becomes a little bit of a crisis. Also, what's happening during this metabolically is we're getting an increase in lactate, which we know lactate itself is not necessarily bad, but what comes with that is an increase in hydrogen ions, and we create a little bit more of an acidic environment, and our body does not like that. So ultimately what happens, for the same amount of the external work, our body has to go through a little bit more internal work to get there, right? Not ideal. And the third crisis, that's the movement crisis, right? Fiber recruitment will change. Initially, these endurance activities, we use our type 1 muscle fibers, right? We're trotting along, no big deal. As fatigue sets in, our body's going to start to recruit those type 2 muscle fibers, right? Nice thing there. More power. The trade-off, though, we can't do as many fine motor movements with those. Those are our big muscles, right? So we start to switch these fast twitch muscles that has a little bit of a higher metabolic cost, but it also throws off our movement pattern. Okay, if we're fine-tuned with like our stride cadence when we run, or if we think about, again, grappling sports where it's like a really technique heavy, if we lose that fine motor control, our performance is going to degrade, right? So this movement crisis stems from this change in muscle fibers. And the takeaway here, the body recruits less efficient. I put efficient in quotes because that's like a dirty word in our field, efficiency, but for all intents and purposes, we're recruiting less efficient muscle fibers because now they cost more energy to use, right? And that's the problem. So increases metabolic costs and it lowers the control of those fine motor patterns. And the real issue here is it's a cascade. Once one of these crises occurs, there's an exponential chance that the other ones are following suit, right? So if we start off with metabolic stress, right? We're pushing hard, get a little bit of a deep depletion of our glycogen. Maybe we fueled improperly. Well, that's also going to create cardiovascular strain because now we're going to have to work a little bit harder to get that oxygen to the tissues. Well, that cardiovascular strain, now it's going to make our body decide, are we going to get blood to the skin, blood to the tissues? Less blood to the tissues means we're going to be a little bit more anaerobic because there's going to be less oxygen there. So now we're going into the fast twitch. And then that neuromuscular fatigue, obviously, is going to be a performance decline as well. So the big takeaway here is don't think about these in silos, right? They're all happening all at the same time, okay? The nice thing is, even though one accelerates the others, the inverse or the converse, I guess, is true. If you train one up, that's going to help the others along as well, okay? So double-edged sword there, but we can get around it. So how do we do that? How do we train durability? Tyson mentioned it, zone 2. We've talked about zone 2 a lot. We hear zone 2 a lot. This is A number 1, right? And just to put it in context, right? Think about what you do. Elite athletes, elite endurance athletes, 3 to 5 hours in one bout is their zone 2 work, right? They're hopping on the saddle. They're going out for a 5-hour ride, just cruising, maybe stopping at a coffee shop halfway through, right? But for 5 hours of their day. Obviously, we don't have that time. Obviously, our athletes don't have that time. But that's just to say that we can handle quite a bit of volume in zone 2. And we've probably all heard it, but just as a refresher, that's going to alter our mitochondrial density. So we're going to get more mitochondria in the cell. The mitochondria itself is going to grow, that matrix. We're going to get more oxidative enzymes within the cell. So we just make a better metabolic environment there. During these zone 2 efforts, we're also primarily leveraging fat oxidation. So our body gets a little bit better at that process too. So if it occurs, it won't be as detrimental. And it's going to improve cardiac output, right? Strengthen our heart. That'll be a better stroke volume. So when that cardiovascular strain does show up, that crisis does present itself, it's not going to hit so hard. Now, if you have the time to hit 3 to 5 hours at a bout, go for it. But when you look at your training, kind of put the mark for 80% of your training volume. And what I mean by volume here is time spent training, okay? When we talk about energy systems training. If you do 2 hours of energy systems training a week, 80% of those 2 hours should be somewhere around this zone, right? So do more of it than not to get these benefits, to increase your durability. The second way we can train, what we call finish fast protocols. And what these are some low or moderate intensity effort followed by a couple high tempo efforts. And the way I like to talk to my athletes about it, like if I'm working with a runner and they want to run a 20-minute 5K. If they want to run a 20-minute 5K, then they sure as hell better be able to run a 12-minute 3K after a little bit of light exercise, right? Because if you can't do 12-minute 3K, how are you going to hold that for 2 more kilometers, right? So that's kind of the concept here. We do some kind of training. It's just like noise, just to get a little sweat, get a little tired, and then we hit with some fast stuff, right? If you have a race pace or if you have a desired pace to hit, you throw it in there, try to mimic that. Or sometimes what we can do is hit a heavy lift and then go into some kind of sprint afterwards, right? Some kind of heavy ergometer test. Do some heavy squats, jump on the bike, and try to hit maybe a 3-minute all-out test, right? Maybe not, though. But the idea here is to practice race scenarios when the system's already stressed. The exposure to that fatigue is what builds the resistance to that fatigue. And I want to really hang on this because I want to think about the current state of where we are in training. There's a lot of conversation about top speed, measuring top speed. Again, that's great. That tells us the potential. But look at any of those sports, football, rugby, any of those sports that really hang on these top speed metrics, they're not really hitting those top speeds in game. Okay, so we need to introduce this stuff because this will happen in game. They will be fatigued and then have to sprint. And that kind of builds in this durability strength relationship or connection. The stronger you are, the less relative effort these low effort runs or cycles or anything will be, right? Because when we build strength, we're really building those type 1 fibers up. So if we can strengthen those, let's just make these other things a little bit easier relatively, right? That'll also protect these neuromuscular patterns, stronger body, stronger muscles, stronger movements. So we can really fix up that neuromuscular crisis just by lifting heavy. Again, if you're working with endurance athletes, those of you who are, you know this, their sport comes first. They will run, they'll break their freaking ankles and be like, well, I did like an easy 5 yesterday, right? So you don't need to dose them too much here because they're getting a lot of stress, but we do need to include strength training with that. And you can just tell it to them that stronger muscles fatigue slower, right? Easy as that. Andy Jones is one of the big experts in this realm. He's over in Exeter right now. Quote from one of his papers, durability is built not by intensity alone, but by exposure to fatigue. You have to expose your athletes to fatigue and then ask them to perform at race or competition level. Otherwise, when they are faced with this, which they will be faced with in competition, they won't know what to do, right? So durability is built not by intensity alone, but by exposure to fatigue. So strength and conditioning applications. What I've done here now is try to highlight like different archetypes of athletes. Because like I said, this is born out of the endurance world, but I think there are some really strong applications to the other types of athletes we see. So if you have like a field court sport athlete, we can do some game-specific durability. Growing up in Nebraska, the Cornhuskers were always like a fourth quarter team. Everybody held up the big 4 when the fourth quarter came in. So fourth quarter performance is kind of on the mind, right? What's the sprint capacity after accumulated fatigue? Now, we're going to simulate 3 whole quarters of play with your football player? No, but you can break them down quite a bit, get them fatigued, and then just have them at sprint 20s, 10s, right? Nothing huge. But also include change of direction in there because as we fatigue, we also know there is a cognitive decline, right? They need to be able to make these lateral movements, these agile movements, and they need to be able to make decisions, right? They need to be, so give them situations under fatigue where they have to maximally or at max intensity sprint, do lateral change of direction, and then give them some kind of cognitive load, right? So you can do this as an assessment as well. Just be consistent with it, right? The same amount of pre-work and the same max intensity test at the end. Because champions maintain mechanics and decisions while others break down, right? If there's some kind of tactical component, they need to be able to execute that as well during their sport. Now, specific to our topic this weekend, our operational durability, right? These decisions now go from a win-loss to life or death, right? They need to be able to make these decisions on a much greater scale. And they face some unique situations. So what I would do if I was working with operators or athletes, law enforcement, military, things like that, introduce some kind of load carriage and hang on that cognitive performance. So load carriage means you can throw a heavy ruck on them, have them bring their kid in, right, and put them under some kind of fatiguing effort. And then this cognitive performance, there's a few things I like to do. One of them, pretty simple, not always easy, stress them, put them on the bike, make them go for a run in their kit, make it some kind of interval. I like to hang around like 4 minutes of work on the interval, and then I bring them in and they have to do the Fibonacci sequence, which if we know is 1 + 1 + 2, right? So it increases, so on and so forth. The first few rounds, not so hard because they're working with single digits, double digits. But by the third round, when we're talking about the thousands, they have to do that addition in their head under fatigue, right? It becomes a little bit difficult. Another one I like to do, you get like number 6 nuts. They're little, metal nuts. Same thing, run some intervals, do something like that, put them under fatigue. Then to keep their fine motor skills, have them stack them end on end. I get like 10 of them high, right? You can do it pretty easily when you're fresh. But as they fatigue, they start to lose those fine motor skills, and they can't stack those as high anymore. Last one I like to do, there's like sand tables, right, John, where you like draw up a schematic of something, whatever. Same thing, present some kind of sand table. Maybe it's when I have the athletes in my garage, it's like the block that we live on. This is what it looks like. Have them study it for a little bit, do some really fatiguing effort, then ask them questions. Hey, how many houses were on the south side of Robin Hood Lane, right? Make them recall that stuff under fatigue. Because again, fresh, no problem. Under fatigue, it's kind of a little bit more challenging, right? Also, note where your operators are operating at. If there's some unique component, heat, cold, altitude, simulate that, right? Simulate that because they could be in the best shape. They could have great durability at sea level and temperate. Indiana right now is like 75 degrees. But if they're going somewhere at altitude or they're going somewhere where it's going to be a lot hotter than that, durability is going to be different, right? And then lastly, any other mission-specific aspects. So, when I was in Louisville, I was working with the SWAT team. If they knew that they had a raid that was coming up, it was a night raid. Well, a couple weeks leading up to that, we did all of our training at night. It's like, hey, you got to be primed for that. Some of these guys had wives and kids and they had family obligations, so they would roll into training pretty fatigued. But it's like, hey, you still got to be able to do this, right? So really the key with operational durability, you want to train those decision-making processes under stress that simulates whatever stress they're going to be at, as close as you can, right? You probably can't fly up to the mountains for a quick training session all the time, but try to get as close as you can. And then lastly, our multimodal, hybrid, CrossFit athletes, right? This gets unique because we have durability maybe in a single event that will change based off of the movements that we see, right? If we have like 3 different movements, maybe your pacing and your durability for each one of those is a little bit different. So the key here, obviously while maintaining whatever movement standards they have to maintain, figure out a pacing strategy for every movement they're going to face, right? The time domains they're going to face, the volume of movements they're going to face. Just takes a little bit more work on the front end to understand their sport because they're going to be working across different energy systems during their competition. So the hybrid athletes face something a little bit unique. You just need to understand the domains and their capacity in those domains of their event. So again, Monday morning applications. What can you guys do when you get back on Monday morning? You can start measuring. You measure cardiac drift during AMRAPs or conditioning, right? Start building those profiles for your athletes. If you have access to some kind of power meter, which again, like on the Echo bike, you can measure watts, right? Simple as that. And you can use your coach's eye right away. Start filming. Look at the technique breakdowns, and then think about how we can build that back up. In the programming side, start introducing some finish fasts, right? In whatever domain your athlete lives. We talk about progressive overload often with strength and conditioning in terms of increasing the weight, but now we're going to progressively overload the duration. So again, maybe that pre-work to fatigue initially is just like 10 minutes, then 12 minutes, then 15. Kind of the rule of thumb here is a 10% increase per week, right, of that progressive overload. And try to induce that systemic fatigue so you can expose them to their deficiencies. That's all. Any questions?
This episode of Power Athlete Radio is powered by Train Heroic, the most immersive strength training app experience on the market. We've built an online training business by partnering with Train Heroic to deliver all of our world-class training programs like Jack Street, Hammer, Field Strong, and Grindstone. To learn which Power Athlete training program best suits your goals, head to powerathletehq.com/training. And if you're a coach looking to build a business with the best training tech in the business, head to trainheroic.com/powerathletehq. And now back to the show. Hey there, Power Athlete Nation. Big shout out to all the heavy hitters who stuck around till the final whistle. If you've been soaking in the knowledge bombs and epic tales we've been dropping for free, here's your chance to be a game changer. Swing by ko-fi.com/powerathlete and toss a few bucks our way to keep the podcast fueled and firing on all cylinders. That's ko-fi.com/powerathlete. Your support makes a difference. See ya.